Okay. All right, great. So press record, and we're all set for the spring 2020 edition of the MarTech Book Club. Welcome back, everybody. Really excited about this specific one. I think it's a really interesting book and a really interesting topic. And hope you all can see the slides. And we've got some guest speakers that are in here today to be able to talk about like some of the personal experiences that come from serving in the armed forces, and also I think the really important timing on this one is that this book club is happening right before the U.S. long weekend for Memorial Day. So to everybody in our country and around the world who are serving and have served, thank you for your service. And we really think that this is an important topic, and also think that this is a great precursor to some of the many people that I've worked with, that I think we've all worked with, who have taken all of the lessons that they've learned through their service into the corporate world, and what they've done with those now. So really, what, again, to kind of cut this off, we're talking about Extreme Ownership. It's a New York Times bestseller by Jocko Willink and Leif Babin. It really talks about leadership lessons that they learned serving with the U.S. Navy SEALs in Iraq in 2006. And before we get into that, let's do an introduction to everybody that's on the call and some of our different presenters. And let's take it away. Helena, you're first.
I'm Helena Abramova. I'm here in Ashburn, Virginia, outside of Washington, D.C. And by the way, I ran Marine Corps Marathon.
Wow.
Speaking about, yeah. And I work as marketing technology lead at telecom company. And I'm kind of in this Marketo world, running Washington, D.C. Marketo user group and Marketo champion and so forth. And I'm very excited about hearing more and learning more what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, I really am too. And thank you for all your support too over the last year, and coming to the other book clubs and helping to kind of kick this off with some of the other Marketo champions in that community as well. Deborah, I think you're a little newer to the community, but really happy to see you at many different events here. So can you introduce yourself and just tell us, who you are in the corporate world, what you do for your job title, and just give us a background, and maybe how you want to spend your long weekend here.
Sure. So Deb Gatelli from the San Diego user group. I work for a local university alliant, and I'm the Marketo admin. I'm also the Pardot admin as we migrate from Pardot over to Marketo and do a little sprinkling of Salesforce.com admin stuff too. So Memorial Day weekend, I'm going to go to Phoenix, where my 86-year-old mom lives. So I'm bringing her toilet paper.
Okay, awesome.
I will. I have hoarded a little bit, and
that's awesome. Okay.
I'll bring it to her so she doesn't have to go out in the morning.
Let me pivot over to our guest speaker, just to do a bit of an introduction, and Kyle Morris, just go ahead and introduce yourself from the corporate world. We'll get into all the other stuff afterwards, but right now you're in the MarTech industry as well too, so would love to kind of hear what you're doing in that, and what you do for your long weekend, especially for Memorial Day and that sort of thing.
Yeah, for sure. My name's Kyle. I live here in Bend, Oregon, and I run two companies. One is a company called Kicksaw. We do Salesforce consulting for growing tech companies, typically out of the Bay Area, but throughout the US and Canada. I also run a company called Sift Data, and we do tracking of contacts for job changes and stuff like that to help sales folks. So I run two different companies, but most of my background is in sales operations, and I used to run a big sales development team. At the Bay Area, I ran a BR team that grew from 7 to 70 in a couple of years. So I learned a lot from that, transitioned into sales operations, and then moved into Salesforce operations kind of consulting for, like I said, tech companies. So been doing that for about 6 years. What am I doing for a long weekend? I got a 10-month-old and a 4-year-old who are probably gonna be taking up all my time. The weather's nice, gonna try to mountain bike a little bit. So yeah, to make the most of the weekend.
Very cool. Very cool. And so I don't, I think we met each other originally on a project. I'm trying to remember what the project was, but a bunch of years ago, I want to say about
Yeah.
3 or 4 years ago, we worked on so I handled the Marketo, some of the Marketo stuff, and you were on the
Hmm.
Salesforce side of things. And
Hmm.
and always remember, actually, I think your emails were always signed off with Rangers lead the way, I think, if I remember correctly. And that's so when we came up with this topic, that's how, it's like, who do I know who's, can talk a little bit about this? So
Yeah.
go ahead.
Yeah, no. I have RLTW in my email signature, and so I used to be in a unit in the military in the U.S. Army called the Rangers, and that's kind of the motto. So occasionally, I'll see people that see that email and know exactly what it is, and they bite on it pretty hard. So it's kind of like a little calling card that certain people really know, but everybody always has questions. So it's a good conversation starter at least.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Oh, and I guess I should background myself here too. So Michael Tucker, the Conversion Store. So I'm a marketing automation consultant. Just work with different companies and their MarTech stacks, and sort of work as a free agent. Basically, just go around to different businesses as they have different needs to help them out that way. So a Marketo user group leader. I've run the virtual user group for manufacturing since 2017. And then do this and then do a couple other things in different communities as well too. And I think this is a really important, especially in this time. We had this book club going last year for a couple of editions, and then all of us got really busy, but with a bunch of the other Marketo champions. But I think it's important to revisit, especially now with the stay-at-home orders and everything that's happening. It's a great time to grab a book. It's a great time to learn something, and it's a great time to talk about some of those learning lessons with other people and really distill. This will make us a better, stronger people as a whole. All of the challenges that we're going through here, and so in the spirit of that, let's kick off book club. So let me do a slide share here. And so our initial meeting here is again about extreme ownership. And so, I'll do kind of an intro into this book, but I would really want this to be a participatory, open discussion, and want to be able to talk about some of how these concepts relate back to our own personal lives and our own professional experiences. So this is an open forum. You're all unmuted, and you can mute and unmute as you want to, but it's going to be really boring if it's just me talking about the book. And so I'd really encourage all of you to be open and be able to share some of your different experiences and some of the learning lessons in here. If you haven't read the whole book, that's perfectly fine, because again, the conversations are about you and what you're gleaning from the Coles notes, the short code, if you will, that we're going to talk about. So I've distilled some of this down, and in order to make it really quick and easy to understand. And then after that discussion, then I want to turn it over to Kyle and really kind of do a bit of an interview and go in depth a little bit more with his experience and some of the parallels that come from this book. Does that sound good to everybody? Okay, awesome. Okay, so really the way that extreme ownership is built out, as I mentioned before, is there's each chapter is told in a kind of revolving order between Jocko and Leith, talking about their different experiences. And the first part of each chapter really talks about the actual stories that they went through, of what they went through when they were in Iraq. And the second part of each chapter is in, okay, what are the principles? What are the learning lessons in each of those stories? And then how does that apply to the corporate world? Now, they've really been meticulous about trying to anonymize all of the people, for the most part, that are in this book, and talk a little bit more. They kind of refer to people by title instead of by name. So you get a sense of whether they're talking to the owner or whether they're talking to the sales director or a VP of finance or what have you. And then likewise with their different comrades, they've mentioned a couple of different people that they've served with who unfortunately lost their lives in the battle, and then some of the different some people that way. But generally speaking, they've tried to kind of anonymize and allow those people have privacy, obviously, with those. So let's talk a little bit about the battlefield itself too. So they were deployed in in Iraq in 2006 for the Battle of Ramadi. And I don't really want to make this like a big tactical conversation, because I think that that could be a book in and of itself, and there's a lot that you can talk about, especially in military history. But just to give a little bit of context, so you understand that that's one of the bloodiest battles in the Iraqi war here in this last one. And in terms of the people that were in it, so Jocko Willink ran SEAL Team 3, Task Unit Bravo, Bruiser, excuse me. Leif Babin was Charlie Platoon. And, Kyle, you could probably explain the chain of command a little bit more, but as I understand it, Jocko had like a commanding officer status, I guess, over Leaf. And then the third person that's there is Chris Kyle, who, if you ever saw the movie American Sniper, he was in like an adjacent platoon to Leaf. Is that right? Do I have that correct?
Yeah, that's a good way of looking at it. Think of a platoon as a group of 20 to 40 guys, all working together. They know each other very well. Those platoons all roll up to a task unit who Jocko ran. So Jocko is managing about 4 Leifs, right? And Leif manages his platoon of 30 or 40 people, individual leaders there. And Chris was an individual contributor within a given platoon. So it would have been a pretty cohesive unit of about maybe 100 guys who worked together.
Wow. Wow. And it's interesting too, because I find it challenging trying to keep track of all the meetings and all the different people I have to kind of interact with. But I also don't have people trying to kill me while I'm in the process of doing that. So, Helen, you work in a big company. Do you have anybody that's trying to kill you in them, or how are your meetings going out with us?
Well, I'm not sure if it's related to this particular book, but from my point of view, it's very important to limit number of unnecessary meetings. And when I mean unnecessary, whenever you have a peer or someone on your team who can go there and be like represent your team, that's probably the best approach. And sometimes I believe it's just important to like have this like, the Rocco was always talking about mission, right? So I'm always trying to keep, okay, why I'm going to this meeting, if it's like, even if it's important in terms of like what I'm going to achieve on a bigger scale. If not, maybe I don't need to, because I mean, it's gonna be always much more meetings that I can ever attend. That's why, kind of like having this bigger mission picture. And at the same time, sometimes I feel some of the meetings are really important in terms of communicating and distributing information.
Mm-hmm.
And I cannot, like, I can't sometimes even explain it. It's just like, I feel that it's important.
Mm-hmm.
Or I feel that there is like some kind of like brewing tension, and it's just like, okay, let's just talk. And it's all going to be kind of resolved.
Yeah.
So communication is like, yeah.
I think that too. I was just going to say that. So a lot of this book is about communication and about about leadership, from the challenge of being able to kind of deal with multiple stakeholders and have them interact. Have everybody get on the same plan, and so that's a big piece of this as well too. Let me go in and talk a little bit about the agenda and about some of the themes that kind of come up through within this. So, within all of the chapters, as we discussed earlier, they're all broken into 3 parts. So the first part of that is really the war within, where they talk a little bit about, that initial concept of extreme ownership, that you as a leader are the ultimate person that's responsible for the performance and the successes, but also, very importantly, the failures within your group as well too. So there's no bad teams, only bad leaders. Believe, so understand that you have to believe in the mission before you can ask other people to do it, and you have to ensure that they believe in it as well too. And then check the ego. And we'll cover into each of these. The laws of combat is the second area of the book, and so cover and move is generally what they've described in that book as kind of the tactical approach of being able to kind of approach some of these projects. Simple which I think kind of Helena was just talking about as well too, in order to be able to make your project plans, make your orders something that's easily understood. And we also talked about that in the Bill McDermott book last year too, about how, as he was growing in Xerox and at SAP, how, he had broader, more larger groups of people that he was responsible for. It just made it all that much more important to be able to simplify the message so that the broader group of people are able to understand and then to fall in line. So prioritize and execute, and then decentralize command. And if anybody wants to jump in about any of those, go ahead.
There's a lot to cover. I mean, I think Jocko covers really well the cover move piece. And I mean, decentralized command, it's, as organizations grow, one of the things that you really got to think about is that no individual person can control everything. It's one of the challenges of really growing something, is that if you started it, you feel like you need to have your hand in every pot. But the reality is you've got to train people to have their hand in the pot so that you can focus on all of the folks in charge. And so it's a reflex that's not natural for most people. In a leadership position, you think, I've got to do everything. I'm the leader. But being a leader really means I've got to enable other people to take action and take responsibility, feel like they have control over a situation, because there's just too much for any one person to do. So, I mean, the book says it a lot better than I can, but I'm happy to give context or stories that kind of align with.
Yeah. Yeah, no, definitely feel free, anytime, jump in for sure. I think back to actually an experience that I had that was really important career-wise for me was I met Michael Dell in the early 2000s. I was at a Vancouver Board of Trade event. He was doing a speaking session, and I run up there right away, and I go to get an autograph, and I try to get a picture with him using one of those cheap disposable cameras. It was the last I did, and the camera broke. But anyway, I digress. His book was direct from Dell, and maybe that would be a good one to cover too. I got an autograph from him with it, but he had the same problem. They had that extreme growth that went through, and think the 90s and the 2000s and how fast Dell was growing. And his, one of the big things that he said is I just needed to find a way to split my job, everybody's job. He even had a co-CEO, right? He'd split, here's the guy at the top of the org chart, and he's splitting the org chart, which some people might think that, well, if I'm splitting the org tree, I might splinter the whole tree, but I think it made for a stronger base. And that's very much what Bill McDermott did at SAP as well, too.
And
go ahead, go Helena, and then Kyle. How's that?
Right. What I want to say, from my point of view, like one of the most annoying thing is whenever a leader is trying to ask too detailed questions, or like going into like too much detail, and it's like, aren't you trusting me? Like, why are you asking? Like, this is not what you have to be focused. Give me the bigger goal, and like, let me do that, and let me get back to you. Don't ask me until it's like you see that it's not working, or something is broken, or like why are we talking about? Do we have like a bigger thing to talk? That's kind of sentiment that I think it's relevant here.
Yeah.
In that vein, one thing that the U.S. Army uses to kind of teach battle situations are called battle drills. So an example of how to do your job, there's so much nuance that goes into a given task. Let's say I'm saying, go do research on X. There's a million ways you could do that. You could pull out an encyclopedia, you could go to the internet, you could go to the library. There's a lot of ways that that's done. And typically as a leader, you want to define what success looks like. This is what I need you to deliver to me. The method with which it should be done is kind of up to you, but I need to communicate to you like tactics to get this done. So in the military, you may get, like for infantry, you may get in a firefight at any time. And they can't tell you if it comes from here, if it comes from there, what if this happens? There's too many scenarios that could come up. So they teach you core concepts, just like in business, right? Like I'm not going to tell you when you receive fire to flip your safety from safe to semi and then pull the trigger. That's too much detail, right? You can't communicate all those things to all the people. So you teach everyone at a high level the core concepts so that when you take fire, everybody knows broadly what we should be doing. And then they can take their individual actions that make sense to them. But it's kind of like a school of fish. Everybody's swimming in this direction, but each fish does its own thing to go in that direction. So it's really important that people learn that concept, Because if everybody goes this way, but two people go that way because they don't understand what's supposed to happen, you're gonna have a lot of problems.
Yeah. I feel like every time I watch like an American football game, well, I guess even probably any organized sports, it's the same sort of thing. Is the plays that get blown in a football game are because the playbook isn't executed properly. But if you do enough practice on it, that kind of gets you queued up with it.
You get burned on a 75-yard pass in football because one cornerback made the wrong decision. What happens when you have 40 guys taking fire from 7 directions and IEDs are going off? You've got to know that they're not going to let that receiver go past you, right? You've got to have trust in your team. And that's where, the special operations community, an advantage is that people tend to have been there for a while. You've learned to work with people, right? Like there were people in the military that have been there 20 years that have worked together with the same people in the same team for 20 years and been in combat the whole time. So like these are folks who like really know their jobs inside and out, to the point where I don't have to think, is this other person doing a good job? Just like in football, I know the quarterback has the deep side, so I don't have to worry about it. But if you don't have that trust and that camaraderie that you established over a long period of time, you're always looking over your shoulder to make sure that the other person's doing the right thing. And so that's one of the advantages of special operations, is that there's a lot of cohesiveness and trust. So I know that this person's got my back and I've got this person's back and that person has someone else. So it makes it, you can scale more quickly, right? You can operate more quickly when you've thrown away a lot of the basics that other folks have to work.
Yeah. So definitely, I think with this book, kind of coming back to the book, you really saw that as they were talking about trying to work with the Iraqi soldiers too, and what that leap of faith was like in going into some of those hostile environments too. And I thought that was really compelling to kind of hear a little bit about how, how they initially had kind of the misgivings about working with the Iraqis, and then, found different strengths by incorporating them into some of the plans versus, when they go to kind of work with other branches from the U.S. as well too, to understand, well, it's different because I know that they have had that training. So going into a combat situation with them is a lot less riskier. And I think that's kind of like that in our corporate lives too. And you try and vet the people that you work with, or what task you give them based on their experiences to play to their strengths.
Yeah, if you're acquiring another company that's small and you've got to merge those folks into your way of doing things and they're resistant, or there's cultural language barriers, imagine that. They don't even speak the same language and you're trying to incorporate them into your business and the way of operating. It's a hard thing to do. Then you throw in the challenge of combat. People die, and how you react is really, it can go either direction, and so that cohesiveness is really important. And it's not something you can turn a key on. It takes a lot of time to develop. And that's where I think, that tactical patience of knowing that this can't be done overnight is going to be important. Same for business. Like there's a Warren Buffett quote. It's like, you can't make a baby in 1 month by getting 9 women pregnant. Same thing in business, right? Like you've got to recognize that certain things will take a certain pace and you can't push it fast.
Yeah, I totally get that. Let's move into part 3 here. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to, say, what I'm hearing and thinking of is, in some cases, and especially for marketing operations and marketing technology, that's what we are doing, right, in our daily work. Sometimes there is no clear mission, and that might be a huge problem. Mm-hmm. Because in many cases, we are kind of like process-oriented. We are kind of delivering something that is not. Whenever I'm hearing, because I was listening to the book, there's and win, and I was like, but what win means in my, for example, context? Mm-hmm. It might be many different things, because yes, we do have quarterly and yearly goals, but it's also important how we are getting there and how much we help others. So it's like, this is where we have to be probably more focused on how we're defining the mission, especially when there is no clear win. Win for whom? For us, for our specific unit, like for our small group, or are we talking about the business? And if you're talking about business, maybe it's not that clear what exactly we have to do, because what we are doing is impacting so many different things, and we have to prioritize what exactly we want to impact to make sure that this big thing is changing, right? So I think that's probably one of the challenges that marketing technology, marketing operations people might be facing.
Yeah. Yeah.
To challenge that, I would say war is not a lot different, right? Because like, so as an individual soldier on the battlefield, how do I help win the war? What am I supposed to do? What do I do next to help us get closer to being done with this war? It's unclear. As a platoon or a company or a battalion or a regiment, it's still unclear what we do to win this war. That's why from a leadership perspective, you've got to define, this is our vision. In Iraq, we're going to, embed our teams within. We need to win hearts and minds. That's a very high, broad strategy. The tactics to do that are different, and individual people on the ground will need to make decisions to solve those problems. So from a marketing perspective, our goal may be to improve brand awareness, conversion rates, right? Those are high level strategies. How we do that tactically is kind of up to the folks on the ground. The general shouldn't be saying, you go storm that building. He or she doesn't have time to do that. You on the ground make that decision, but they should be saying, we need to make sure that this city is safe. And you as tacticians need to figure out, how do we make sure that we accomplish that goal?
Mm. Yeah,
So
definitely.
taking a large problem and breaking it down into small tactical problems that get solved by individuals or teams.
Yeah. Okay, let me keep going into part 3 for a second here. I love this. There's so much that you can get into here with us, and in this last part, and we'll cover off. I have highlighted all this dichotomy of leadership section that they've written up, which I think are a series of bullet points that really just speak to leadership in brief bullet points that are easy for us to kind of pick through, and it really talks about the value of the book and the overall philosophy. So, plan is exactly what we were just talking about, leading up and down the chain. I love, just kind of segues perfectly into what Kyle was just saying, and then talking about uncertainty and basically being able to talk again about some of the different attributes. That final chapter is the attributes as a leader that you need to maintain as you start to scale out your organization. I want to just jump quickly too, for anybody who hasn't read the book too, to just kind of jump into kind of what lesson 1 is all about, which I think really kind of underlines the overall phase of the book too. So it gives kind of some concepts on this, but just to kind of read this aloud here. In any team, in any organization, all responsibility for success and failure rests with the leader. The leader must own everything in his or her world. There is no one else to blame. The leader must acknowledge mistakes and admit failures, take ownership of them, develop a plan to win. I think, just kind of opening that up. I mean, we all have leadership roles in different respects. And Deborah, can you tell us a little bit about, kind of what leadership looks like in your organization right now, with everything that's kind of happening right now? And are you leading? Do you, what does your kind of leadership look like in these remote work times? And how are they, how do you see kind of the interactions in terms of kind of ownership and kind of keeping a consistent plan with all of the, I don't want to call it chaos, but I want to call it disruptions, I guess is maybe the right word to use.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because our group is very collaborative. There's a lot of senior people. We're all specialists in what we do. And there's only, 4, 5, 6 of us. So I often, I sort of kid our group and I say, yeah, I'm the breacher, right? I'm running email, I'm pounding down doors. So my goal is to keep our email performance really high and to get into the inbox. And then there's people who are creative and run the website. The interesting thing about our team is our leader, who was there for 11 years, left. And the new person came in to lead at a position higher, right? So our AVP of marketing left after 11 years, and our VP of marketing came in, who's only been there 2 months. And she's expected to do her job, which is to set strategy, but all of a sudden she's also the ops person because the AVP has left. So we've been trying to rally around her, right? Taking extra responsibilities that are more operations to leave her to do strategy, but it's going to take a while.
Yeah. Well, let me segue to lesson two, because I think that that actually is an interesting parallel to what's in the book about being able to transition people from, well, from one role to another. And I'm not saying, by the way, this isn't the parallel that this is happening in your company. So please, I need to make sure that we explicitly say that. But in the book, they talk about basic training that you go through in the Navy SEALs, and there's this wonderful story where they have these boats. So when leaders who epitomize, let me read this. When leaders who epitomize extreme ownership drive their teams to achieve a higher standard of performance, they must recognize that when it comes to standards as a leader, it's not what you preach, it's what you tolerate. So the photo is my best attempt to kind of grab the book of what they go through with training, and this is what happens. I guess you have a half a dozen guys that are that's part of their basic training to kind of take this boat around all over the place, and they have, I guess, races more or less. And so Jocko was supervising a group through this basic training process, and noticed that that there are a team that's in first place, a team that's in last place, and they took the leaders of both of those teams and flipped them around. And it was interesting to see how how each of those leaders kind of approached their teams and how their teams responded afterwards. That the team that was in last place, now with the first place leader, watching him implement that, I think they came in. Kyle, was it second place that they came in at the end of that race, at the end of the training session?
Yeah, good enough to not be last for sure, and keep having to do iterations.
It's really impressive to see. So, really, and it's interesting to see, as we come into different engagements, and I think, Kyle, you and I kind of both kind of go into different companies at different points in time. So, it's kind of getting an assessment of what is the current situation, and what's that delta. What do you need? What sort of changes need to be able to happen, if it's organizational culture, or if it's technology, or all sorts of different areas inside of a business, in order to be able to drive success. And so I can't wait to hear kind of what nets out of that. Are you seeing changes already, Deborah, or what's to kind of take it to from a corporate perspective? Is that process just starting?
It's just starting because it's
Okay.
only been 2 months. And to load on top of that, we have all these hallway conversations because thankfully we're all in the same building on the same floor. I even know when you separate, when you divide people in a building just between floors, all of a sudden people, the engineers can't come up to the marketing floor because they'll be looked at as, turncoats. I used to meet them literally in the stairwell. And our general manager said, Deb, you can write all over the walls with the engineers as, I'll paint over them later. Mm-hmm. So, so all the hallway conversations went away. So here's a time when we're trying to, get close to our new VP and give her hints and, and collaborate, like I said, in the hallway, and that's gone. Mm-hmm. It's all virtual, and it's very easy for her to disappear into meetings all day, all week, and the first thing was setting up one-on-ones. It took about 2 months for her to do it, because you just get inundated with, don't you know how to do this? You're the VP of marketing. You should know how to do this. And she goes, should I? I've only been here 2 months. So
I definitely feel like as we get exposed, and Kyle, maybe you can talk about, some of the different engagements and some of the different experiences that you've seen corporate wise. And Helena too, I think, you'll, as you go through different teams within your enterprise, right? Different people lead differently. And anybody have any stories about like unorthodox leadership that really worked out, that you'd see something just completely different?
I've got a quick kind of point on this that I think will segue a little bit more, which is I think individual contributors often, if they're reading this book, think that it applies to leaders, like the manager of my team or the CEO of the company or the battalion commander. That's who needs to read this book. But the reality is everybody is a leader of something. That may be the leader of yourself, maybe leader of a team or a bunch of teams. But, if you just assume that leadership is taking care of something, let's say you're a Marketo consultant, you're leading an implementation, or you're responsible for your own scope of work. And if you treat it as, I am responsible for its success, the same way that the battalion commander says, I am responsible for this success, it changes your mindset quite a bit, rather than saying, well, I didn't get good information from my boss, so therefore I can't be successful, right? It's about taking extreme ownership for what you can individually control. And it seems it's very much pitted as a leadership book, but it's like a general success in your career book.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't matter whether you're a leader or not. So when I was in the Rangers, I had to go to Ranger school, and there was a time in there where you're not necessarily in a leadership position. And somehow I ended up being nominated for an award as an informal leader, which means I wasn't necessarily a person put in a leadership position, but when I had the opportunity to informally lead, I stood out relative to my peers. So there are lots of ways you can lead without being a designated leader. I think a lot of people just assume that it's either you're my boss or you're not. But the reality is there's tons of people who lead in your organization. They may lead culturally, they may lead from a knowledge standpoint, but they aren't necessarily in a leadership position. And I think that a lot of folks kind of forget.
Interesting. How do they know, or how are you kind of judged for that award? Like, I mean, you can't really stop and have a performance review in the middle of a battlefield, right? So how does that work?
So this was in training. So I was going through a course called Ranger School, which is probably pretty comparable to what Navy SEAL selection process is. It's like a 60-day course where you don't eat or sleep. So that's pretty much it. And you're running around in the woods. The way that you're kind of graded on that is the instructors had recognized me as a person who, in several situations, had stood out where, there were times when I wasn't necessarily in a leadership position, but I kind of rallied people to accomplish something. So a few people had recognized that, so I stood out relative. So it wasn't about I was in combat and I got some special award. This was in training. But that concept, that mentality of, if I see something wrong, I can fix it and I can improve it, whether or not I'm told from my manager or my boss or my leader to do it, is something that you want to encourage. And I think that that's what they teach a lot in special operations, is that if you see something wrong, go fix it, right? If you're the new guy, you see a bad guy with a gun running around, you don't go turn to your boss and say, hey, I see a bad guy with a gun. You need to act on it. So they really want to encourage that mentality of, own this piece of, even if your piece is just watching this little sector of a window or something like that, that's yours. You got to own it big time, because everybody's relying on you to own that type of you got to make sure.
It's like individual ownership. Actually, this is reminding me
Extreme.
of an old, yeah, exactly. It's reminding me of an old Fortune magazine article that I had read. I don't know why I remember this, but Gordon Bethune, who is the CEO of Continental Airlines, and I want to say this is the late 90s. He started out working in the Air Force as a mechanic and worked his way up through into the corporate world, and was talking a little bit about how he wound up being a mechanic over everything else. And I guess as part of his intake, you have a series of aptitude tests, and he had just scored exceptionally high on having mechanical skills. He just said you'd make a really good mechanic. You should go in and do. And apparently he had never really thought about himself that way before even doing it. And that one little nudge and piece of recognition now, led to him kind of running one of the biggest airlines in the country.
I'm certainly not at that level, but my perspective of being a leader before being in the military was I was certainly not a leader in my life as a younger person. And then being in the military, I was running kind of like a team, and I was on search and rescue team, and I learned these leadership skills. It's a skill that you can learn, just like playing chess or riding a bike or throwing a football. They are things you can learn. Once you've learned them, the principles, you can apply them in different situations. So that's kind of a thing that I think folks shy away from. They're like, well, I'm not a natural leader, so this isn't going to be for me. You can learn those things and you can become that person. So it takes time, it takes hard work and a lot of mistakes, but it's definitely something you can develop.
Yeah. How did you, just kind of pivoting to that, then, let's talk a little bit about how did you get into it in the first place? Were you an ROTC in high school, or did you always think that this would be? Do you have family that was in it? Is it something that historically was in your background, or did you just kind of stumble across it?
Yeah, definitely didn't stumble across it. My dad had been in the Air Force right after Vietnam. He was like a uh, military police, so he wasn't doing anything very sexy. He was just guarding missile silos. His dad had been in the Navy between World War II and Korea, or Korea and right before Korea, I want to say. And so he wasn't in combat, and he was like on the Navy, not doing anything too sexy. For me, why the military became more of a thing, it was an option as a kid, was because I couldn't pay for school. My parents didn't have any type of money to do that. And September 11th happened when I was a junior in high school. So the very like impactful time in my life. It's like Pearl Harbor as a junior in high school. You're not going to not join from the family I'd come up in. So that was definitely the path. And I joined the military with the intent of paying for college. So when you join the military, you get some sort of money for college, and I took the absolute most I possibly could. So that was very much my intention. I'm going to go into the military, spend some time there, ideally in the Rangers, and then I'm going to go to school and do the rest of my career. So kind of work.
So you knew you wanted to be in the Rangers specifically, or was it just I was going to be in any branch, whichever one would have me?
No, I was going into the Rangers. So when I joined, you actually get a contract. They
Okay.
guarantee you a job. They guarantee you a duty station. You can get guarantees in your contract depending on how much the military needs you. When I was joining, they needed folks for special operations, so I could go into the Rangers. I wanted to do infantry. That was a job I was shooting for. They tried to pit me as a medic or communications guy, but I shot that down and was able to get infantry. So I had a guaranteed shot at selection. There's no guarantee I was going to make it through, but they basically saved me a spot in selection. I was able to make it through, and then I made it into the Rangers, and then that's where the rest of my career kind of went from.
So interesting. So interesting. Um, let me, I don't want, I want to kind of pivot to your story because I really feel like, A, we're kind of halfway through the time that we've allotted, but B, I also think that there's a lot that we can discuss as well, that sort of relates back to the book too. So, what's that initial time, you're talking about like not being guaranteed to make it through. How tough is it? Like, they say that it's not physical strength in the book, that it's more mental strength because you're not sleeping much, and that the strongest
Mm-hmm.
guys kind of fizzled out early on because they didn't have the mental stamina
Yeah.
for it.
Yeah, there are lots of people who've written good books on how to make it through a tough selection, like Delta Force or Navy SEALs or Army Range. There's a lot of people who have different perspectives. The angle that I took was, okay, so think about a goal in work. I need to get to 300 inbound leads a day. That's a target. I need to be able to do that because it's going to impact all these other things. To make it through selection for the Rangers, there are certain minimums that you have to meet, minimums, certain number of push-ups in 2 minutes, pull-ups, run, things like that. If you can meet those things and just tough out all the discomfort of everything else, you'll kind of just make it through. And so going into it, I prepared by making sure I could meet these standards, right? I knew I could do pull-ups and run and do push-ups, etc. The thing that kind of gets you is when adversity's thrown at you, can you react to it well? So I haven't slept in a day, and we got to go do a 12-mile road march, and they're going to extend it to 16 miles. And I wasn't mentally prepared for that, right? I knew I got to do a 12-miler, but now they're making it 16. Do you have the capacity to be dynamic and pivot and work through that scenario? No individual situation is really that awful, right? If you look at any 5-minute window, any of us could survive that 5-minute window of any of the selections. It's the fact that you got 7,000 5-minute windows you got to do back to back to back to back to back. And that's where I think folks kind of break down. It's not that any one of them is so awful you're going to go throw up or give up. It's that you just don't have the mental capacity to keep just like a little bit of pressure forever. I heard a good story of someone was describing like clams and mussels, right? Like they squeeze and they hold themselves tight so you can't access them. But if you sit and just tap on it and tap on it and tap on it for hours, like monkeys will do this. They'll take a clam and just go pop, 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 pop. And then all of a sudden it opens up because it just gives up. It doesn't have the muscle strength to keep itself so tense forever. That's really what it is you just got to figure out, how do I keep myself locked in and just continue driving forward? Not necessarily the fastest, not necessarily the best, but just don't stop. And myself, I'm not the greatest athlete. I'm a pretty good one. I feel like I'm pretty athletic. But compared to the people that I went through selection with, I was middle of the road by far. Not the worst, not the best. I wasn't the fastest or strongest. I feel like there are smart rangers and there are strong rangers, people who can do a lot of push-ups and people who can do land navigation well. I happen to be in the former, where I happened to be not smarter, but more capable in the things that require that technical aptitude. So I stood out that way, where some people are just strong. They can just tough out any hard scenario you put into them, but they may brute force that. And so I was much more of a finesse type of guy rather than a brute force. And so you need different types of people to do those things. But it's kind of my long-winded way of saying that it takes consistency, right? It's not about going super hard for any 1 5-minute period. It's being consistent over a 2-year period. That's what it's more about.
Is that the time range? It's 2 years?
No, so basic training is what, 3 months, and you go to jump school, which is a month. Then you go to selection for the Rangers, which is another month or so. Then you go to the Rangers. Then you start doing deployments, missions overseas. Go to Ranger school, more missions, more deployments, all that stuff. So it's a 4-year window that I did that. Real training was about six months to a year.
Okay. Okay. Now let me pull into a slide here actually from chapter 4 to check the ego. I don't know if this photo brings any memories to you or not, but ego clouds and disrupts everything: the planning process, the ability to take advice, the ability to accept constructive criticism, can even stifle someone's sense of self preservation. Often the most difficult ego to deal with is your own. Is that, I've heard stories that that's sort of kind of the goal of some of the basic training to kind of weed out that sense of self and more of that sense of us as a unit. Is that accurate?
I think that the fact that someone's screaming in your face, I never was like, this person might punch me in the face and knock me out or kill me. Like, there was never a situation where this guy's yelling at me where I was truly scared. I realized I don't like to get yelled at because I'm making a mistake or something along those lines, or embarrassing myself in front of my peers. But in terms of your ego, what I think he's kind of getting at is that you have to be willing to recognize that you're part of a team. It doesn't matter if you individually succeed if your team fails, because then you still fail yourself. So I think it's all about like more giving yourself up as part of the team, recognizing that, you know what, I'm not in charge in this situation. I have to be a good follower now, not necessarily a good leader. And I think a lot of folks don't have that ego. They think they either know it all or that there's no way they could be wrong. And I mean, I was an 18-year-old dude. There's plenty of times I felt that way. You have to learn to let that go and trust oftentimes people above you or people that are giving you guidance, that they may have more information than you. And this is, I mean, basic training for a person who hasn't played sports or been yelled at in their lives. This is a big shock to folks. But for myself, I made a million mistakes my whole life. This was easy. Like that didn't feel like it was that big of a deal getting yelled at for that. I did a lot of bear crawls in football growing up, so that wasn't a big change.
Right. What's the relationship like then with, did you ever see your instructor after you finished training, and was it amenable? Is there, do you have a distance with that person then afterwards, or what does that look like?
One of my instructors going through selection for the Rangers actually became a squad leader of me. So he became my boss later on down the line. And he was a nightmare in selection. So at the end of, it's called RIP, so Ranger Indoctrination Program. At the end of RIP, they actually do a soccer game, which is really random, between all the instructors and all of the students, which seems weird that you take all these guys who've been going through training together and make them play soccer. But it became combat soccer. So the instructors would like attack you and try to choke you out, and the students would try to choke out the instructors. But it was like unclear how far you could push this type of a thing because people could get hurt. But that was like a way of kind of like saying, hey, we did put you through all of these hard times, but like we're kind of like opening it back up to recognize like you're part of the group now. We're excited to have you. This is success, right? We want you to feel welcome. So they did make our lives miserable for weeks and weeks and weeks. But at the end, they gave us a shot at like evening the score a little bit. So there was a lot of aggressive tackling and things that would have been red cards in normal soccer.
And so it's not just yelling though. There's other ways that they're motivating you. Like how, as a corporate leader, what do you gather from that from a leadership perspective to kind of motivate or light a fire is not necessarily the right word. I know, it's not always about fear or coercion or anything like that, but what's that balance? How are you, you talk about the dichotomy of leadership in chapter 12, right? So, how did you see that kind of as you were going through and being brand new into the military at that point?
Like my take on leadership is that yelling is not going to really get you anywhere, right? There's no loudness of my voice that I can convince a person who's opposed to me to now be like, I totally am on board. what you can do is you can take a person who's very on board, but maybe distracted, and really get them back in line. You know, the good leaders that I had, you know, they set a fantastic example. That's really the first thing. If your leader is ever doing something that's not that great, all of the subordinates will recognize that's an acceptable choice. He talks about this in the book, right? I was always fortunate to have folks we used to have to memorize a Ranger Creed. There's 6 stanzas to the Ranger Creed. And one of the stanzas talks about being in the Rangers, you need to set the example for others to follow, right? Your team is going to look to you. Other people are going to look to your team. And Rangers were in the US Army, the unit that was supposed to establish how they wanted the rest of the Army to act. So we were setting the example for the rest of the military, right? We had to have, one of the things we pride ourselves on was neatness of dress. Our uniforms were always perfect, right? We were the most physically capable. We were the most tactically capable. We needed to be the best. And that really helps change the dynamic in an organization. If you have a team that is always on point, other teams are going to want to emulate that. If you have a team that's always kind of fast and loose with the rules, other teams are going to try to emulate that. So it really comes down to, do leaders expect excellence out of their team, or do they let things slide? And that's where I think you're going to have your team kind of react one way or the other.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so chapter 12 is talking a lot about this, is about the dichotomy of leadership, and I think you almost said the exact same thing about everybody trying to walk that fine line and making challenges. I'm going to flip over here for a second to the book. I couldn't fit all of these into a slide, but if you look at them, in 12, he has different points in saying a leader must lead or be ready to follow. A leader must be aggressive but not overbearing. Must be calm but not robotic. A leader must be confident but never cocky. A leader must be brave but not foolhardy. Leader must be have a competitive spirit but be gracious losers. Must be attentive to detail but not obsessed by them. Must be strong, but likewise have endurance, not only physically but mentally. A leader must be humble, but not passive. Quiet, but not silent. A leader must be close with subordinates, but not too close. A leader must exercise extreme ownership. Simultaneously, the leader must employ decentralized command by giving control to subordinate leaders. Finally, a leader has nothing to prove, but everything to prove.
Seems like he's saying like one thing and then the exact opposite. And what he's really saying is that as a leader, you need nuance. You need to be able to set a good example for your team. Like being friends in the military, it's called being buddy-buddy with people who report to you, right? That creates an interesting scenario where, let's say we're in a combat situation, mm-hmm. and there's something dangerous that needs to be done. And Michael, I need you to do it. But you and I are friends on the weekend, we go party and hang out and blah, blah, blah. And you're like, hey man, why are you picking me for this, right? Mm-hmm. A leader has to keep some sort of a gap between the personal and professional relationship you have with folks. Like when I'm your leader, the expectation goes that I make the decision and you act on it. And if you ever kind of fuzz that line or make it kind of unclear, give someone kind of a break or cut them loose, you're going to make it difficult to impose, not your will, but impose leadership upon the team if you kind of cut corners in certain scenarios, right? Hey, I let this guy slack off on working out for a couple of weeks. Now I'm going to come down on him for not working out. It creates a really hard scenario for your team to understand how to react. If you're consistent as a leader, your team's going to know how they should be acting, what they should be doing so they can be successful in your eyes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Definitely want to kind of translate that into the business world as well too, and kind of really talk a little bit about what happened. So after you get out of the Rangers, and what is that process like? Like, do you get to pick your end date, or and are you sort of thinking at this point, okay, I think I'm ready to go now? What's the thinking? How do how does that work out as you're going to kind of that big transition point out back to civilian life?
Yeah, because it's a big transition, right? I was going from, when I joined the military, I was 18 years old, just turned 18, and coming out, I had just turned 22. So I'm still a young guy. I don't have a lot of experience in life outside of high school and being in the military. And so that transition is pretty tough. Remind me your question again. I got distracted thinking
Oh,
about something else.
yeah, just thinking about, when do you, how does the
Oh, how do
end
you
of
know?
your time
Yeah.
yeah.
How does it wrap up? So in the Rangers, you have a deployment cadence, which is very consistent. You do 3 months overseas, 6 months at home, 3 months overseas, 6 months at home. So you're on this natural cadence of going, coming, coming, going. When it's clear that your time is up, when you join the military, you actually have a contract. You have a start date and an end date. When it's over, you're out. So you process out. A couple months before your last date, you begin to process. You stop doing training, you stop doing workouts, you start going to meetings, and you start signing paperwork. So you start working your way out. So you know that's coming. A lot of folks, it's a really tough transition for them because they're like, I don't know what I want to do after this, and I don't know if I want to stay in. How do I make a decision here? Because it's such a 1 or a 0. I'm either in or I'm out. So folks will stay in and kind of continue. For me, it was I joined the military with the intent to get out and go to school. So I had a very clear path in front of me. A thing that was a little tricky was when I was getting out in 2007, they were doing what's called stop lossing. There was a movie called Stop Loss. What that basically means is the military was short on talented people. So as you were getting out, they would actually keep you in for some period of time or transition you to a unit that was short on people. That's a huge concern, right? I'd been in the Rangers, a special operations unit. I don't want to get put somewhere random that the Army needs me. So I was able to finagle a deal with the military where I renewed my contract into the National Guard so I could go to school and do the National Guard, but avoid doing further deployment. So that was my transition period out. For a lot of folks, it's really hard because you're moving from a group of people you've worked with for years into, I don't know anybody, nobody's like me, they don't have this experience. So all of a sudden you're very different than everybody when you've been just like everybody else. Mm-hmm. Like in the Rangers, they all look like me. They were 22-year-old dudes who played sports in high school and loved to do this thing. Now you're around a bunch of people who have no experience living like that, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, imagine you go to a place and live there who no one had ever worked in tech. They'd never used a computer before. You'd be like, how do I communicate with you? How do we resolve differences? I just have a different way of doing it. I have a different way of communicating with people. So it can be very hard for folks, which is, you hear a lot about transitions with veterans. He talks about it in the book, PTSD. You're coming out with experiences that no one can ever have or no one does have. And they're trying to fit you into their mold and you're trying to fit them into your mold. And it just doesn't work well. It's square peg, round hole in a lot of ways. So it is hard on a lot of folks. But once you can get past that transition, things kind of smooth out. And if you can reincorporate yourself back into the normal world, it just becomes like something normal. But a lot of folks have a hard time bridging that gap.
Yeah. Why do you think that you were able to do it so well, and others weren't? Did you think it's like family background, or was it special training that you'd received, or was it going into school right away or something like that?
It might have been luck, genetics, luck of the draw, the way I was able to turn things on and off. That could have been an advantage. It's hard to know. So after the military, I went into school, got a degree in 3 years. So I raced through as fast as I could. I don't know. I had a great support network around me. I was fortunate. I came back with all my fingers and toes, so that's good too. Yeah. And one thing that was a big advantage for me in school is I didn't have any stress about money because when I joined the military, all of my college was paid for. So I went to school and I got to focus on that, focus on me and recovery and getting, reintroducing myself into civilian life rather than being stressed about how am I going to pay for school? How am I going to get food? That's a whole different level of stress that I just didn't have to worry about. So that reincorporation in civilian life for me relative to most folks was pretty seamless.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. What would you say to other people, kind of considering the education process? And it sounded like it worked out really well for you, was worth it. Did you ever have doubts about that? You ever think when you were starting out, maybe I should just get a job at the fast food joint and kind of do that instead? Or?
When I was a kid, when I was in high school, I pumped gas, so I didn't want to do any other jobs like that. It was a pretty okay. Not great. When I went into the military, when I was starting to get out, the question was, what am I going to do now? I could go to school, but what do I want to be? Yeah. And so as I was transitioning out, I had a friend, he was my best friend growing up, went to school at the University of Oregon, and he'd studied entrepreneurship. And I actually went and visited him and sat in on some classes with him. I was like, this seems like kind of interesting, something that I'd be interested in. So when I went to school, I chose the University of Oregon and picked entrepreneurship specifically for that. So it just aligned more with kind of my mentality and what I wanted to do. So again, for me, the transition was seamless, but for a lot of folks, they come out and they're like, I guess I could go get a job at the place I worked before I joined the military, or I guess I'm going to go do manual labor. Or a lot of folks went into contracting for the military. So they would sign up for, one of these units that the military contracts out to do private security for diplomats or whatever. So they kind of get stuck in kind of that same group of people and same mentality, where I went from an Army Ranger to going to school in Eugene, Oregon, which is almost the exact opposite type of a place. And so it just kind of made me reframe my thinking versus being stuck in a rut.
Yeah. Do you see, so I know you were saying before about, the language being very different. I'm sure there's well, I guess in
Yeah.
MarTech, there probably are a bunch of different acronyms, but
It's
just
more than
different
you'd
types.
expect.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But, did you, looking back on your time after, after basic training, after school, in your career itself, Jocko's talking in the book about having to prepare all these PowerPoint slides for
Mm,
senior leadership. That surprised me. I really wasn't expecting him
mm.
to have some of those parallels. I figured if anything, you're in a tent and a map, like you know what I mean, like in the movies. But
Yeah. A lot of times that does happen. In reality, there are times where you're drawing, it's called a sand table. You build out what the mission looks like in sand with, like, this is a building, this is a helicopter, right? So you do a lot of that. But I mean, the military is a bureaucracy. There are a million people there. You can't just have people building sand tables to do these complex invasions. You need like systems and processes and tools like PowerPoint, right? It's an effective mechanism to communicate. There's not a surprise the military is going to adopt a lot of the things that civilians do well. It's just another technique. And so you'd be surprised how much paperwork is going on, how much BS and just shuffling stuff around happens in the military. For every one person kicking down a door in Iraq, there's 7 or 8 support people, just like getting them food, filling up their tanks, fixing their helicopters, like all those things to get Kyle into the door to go catch one bad guy. It's like how many people, but it's no different than a sales rep. How many people support the sales rep signing a contract with a customer? It could be dozens of people. That's the intent. You have people doing different roles, but all support the whole organization. So it's not different. It's just a different application of it. Same with police officers, people working on the cruisers, and then there's certain people that are catching drug dealers. So it's every organization is kind of structured in the same way.
yeah. I mean, and that technology flows the opposite way, right? Look at we're
Yeah.
all on the internet. Thankfully, the Department of Defense had, if ARPANET hadn't been there back in the 70s, would we be doing what we're doing now?
GPS. We got GPS on our phones. That comes from military applications. So it definitely goes both directions, right? Military learns the best from civilian world. Civilians copy, especially with, after World War II, there was a big transition of people who'd been in the military into the civilian world. So there was a lot of adoption of just like those practices and techniques. With, the war on terrorism at a different stage right now, a lot of people have moved into the civilian world that had been in the military. So there's, you see lots of things on social media, people starting companies that are around tactical gear, and that's a very natural application. But a lot of Fortune 500 companies are trying to hire veterans because they have this perspective of working in extreme conditions and making, like, duct taping things together to make things work, that folks who've just not experienced that sort of adversity just don't know how to. It's a different muscle to flex that not many people have the need to flex, when you're getting shot at and your helicopter's crashing or something. It's a different kind of mentality that can be advantageous to a lot of businesses.
Yeah. How so let's jump back to your career then afterwards and you had just led off this conversation with this before you had started your businesses, you were leading a group going from 2 to 70 people, did you say?
7 to 7 years. So my first job out of school was I got a job as a sales development rep at a tech company out of the Bay Area. It was a company with about 50 people in it, and we had 7 SDRs or so. So I got brought in. And then after a few months, our boss got promoted to become the CEO. And so they needed someone to kind of manage the team. So I just, as a default, would sit in on meetings for folks because I was a little bit older than everybody, having been in the military before school. After that, they go like, Kyle, can you manage this thing? And at that point, my mandate was to grow it. So we were in a pretty big inflection point. So we went from 77 people up to about 70 in my team of SDRs in about 2 years. The company, tripled in size in a couple of years, and my team was the biggest growth point there. So we had for sales development side of things, we had a different ratio where we had 2 SDRs for every 1 sales rep. Or oftentimes we'll have 1 SDR for every 2 sales reps. So we just had a kind of an inverted model, which meant we had a lot of people there.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now,
Yeah.
I don't know if I read this correctly, but I was trying to look up you're the 75th Ranger Regiment, and on the Army's website they say that that's for large scale deployments. If I read that correctly, and does that mean to say that you are working in with larger groups of people and larger projects? Like, did you find a parallel basically with the scale that you're scoping up to in organizations with what you were doing in your military career then too? Or do you think somebody, if you were in the Navy SEALs or if you were in a different branch, would that have been a different experience to prepare you for specifically what you're going through with your career there in that job?
Yeah, so I should talk a little about what the Rangers are, and then
Yeah.
how it would have been different had I been in like the SEALs or Special Forces or something different, and how they kind of all relate. So the Rangers are a Tier 2 Special Operations Unit. So Tier 1 would be Delta Force, SEAL Team 6, right? Those are, and then there's a unit called the PJs and a couple other small ones. The Tier 2 units are Special Forces, Rangers, and most of your Navy SEALs. So I was in a group that was on par with those types of things. Remind me your question again. I'm like getting too excited talking about Navy SEALs and stuff.
Yeah, just want to know how that experience in that specific branch for your career, for what you're doing with the growth in your sales team.
Yeah, you're asking initially about the Rangers do like large missions and things like that. And so the Rangers, similar to SEALs and Special Forces, operate in groups of 40 guys. We'd go out on a mission, catch a couple bad guys, and come back and maybe do that again every night for 90 days. So you learn to operate independently from the whole broader organization. So you're in a platoon of guys, of 40 guys. There are 27 platoons in the Rangers. So you're one of 27 operating independently. Occasionally you work together, occasionally separately. How that applied to work is like very night and day different, right? But that said, I think a lot of the lessons you learn, similar to like what Jocko wrote of like, this is how we operate. This is how we communicate with people. This is how we set missions, we lead, we, accomplish things. Those types of concepts definitely apply into business. Like that's why Jocko writes these books, is that there are so many parallels. The difference is, am I putting my life at risk or am I like putting my deal at risk? They're just very, very different like results of this. But I wouldn't call it the stakes, but the like pressure you put on yourself to be successful can be advantageous in both scenarios, right? It's just what the downsides are is what the other side of it is.
How do you find it now working for yourself now? Like, so, you get to 70 people and then you make another transition point and say, okay, I'm going to take a step and actually do this on my own. There's no guaranteed paycheck. It's me doing this with 2 different companies now too. So.
Yeah. One of the things that helps in being in a special operations unit is that you learn to have a tempo of pushing yourself that other people don't have.
Okay.
Right. Every day in the Rangers, we were up at 6 o'clock. The term we'd use is shit, showered, and shaved. You're like ready to go downstairs, ready to work out. You go work out for 2 hours and you go do training for 7 hours. Like your tempo on weekends, we'd go party and then work out, and you just kept pushing the envelope. It wasn't about any one day being the most intense day, but it was just about consistency, always moving forward. Moving into an entrepreneurial type position, I'm like, I don't love a whole lot of structure and people above me. I want to do my own thing. And so once I was able to have complete direction of where I wanted to go, I felt like I could go much faster. It aligned better with my skill set. Like I know where I want to go. I see where I want to be. I know how to get there. I'm going to do it. Not everybody's got that. I was fortunate to get that gift. So I don't know about gift, but that skill. And I think the background I had in the Rangers, had I just gone to college and then got this job, I would have been a garbage like leader of these companies. I would have been terrible. The lessons I learned in the military absolutely apply here, not only in my individual drive, but the expectations I have for others. I know what people are capable of doing. I've seen people do really, really incredible things and push themselves much further than they could think possible. Like the idea of going a couple days without food or sleep is inconceivable. I've seen hundreds of guys do it who I thought was inconceivable for me too. And I was fortunate to be able to make it through. So I know people have a lot more in their tank than they realize. It's just, how do you get them to realize it and then express that and actually see it through? So that's where I know you can do a lot more than you think. And so it's been, that's been a good skill to have, I think.
Yeah. How, so thinking back to all of the different commanding officers and people that have been in leadership positions, what could you tell us a little bit about which one was your favorite or some of the favorite attributes that you've seen of them and how you've incorporated that into your businesses now?
Yeah, there was a there was a guy. He was our platoon leader for the second half of my time in the Rangers. He'd been at West Point. He was the last quarterback to beat Navy. So he went to West Point. He was a quarterback. So he's like, his name's Chad. He's like good looking guy, tall. He's like great at everything he does. But I mean, he came in and we'd been a platoon that had been working together for years. New guy comes in and he's our boss. So there's initially a little bit of like hesitation, but he came in very humble, recognized that we had worked together for a long time. He had a lot to learn, but he was there to support us and make us successful. So he was like, help show me how I can get out of your guys' way and get other people out of your way so that we can get through this thing safely. So he was very good about training himself up, keeping high standards for the rest of the team, but also being very approachable. Like, his name's Chad and he played quarterback at West Point. Like, he's a cool guy. Like, he's just a good person. So it was nice to have a relationship with a leader who felt approachable, but also like demanded excellence at all times, right? You don't get to be the quarterback at West Point because you're like lax with everything you do. Like, you're a talented person throughout your whole life. So like, he really set the example for us to follow, which is one of the part of the Ranger creed. Like, you've got to set the example as a leader for other people because they'll just try to be just like you. So he's been successful pre and post military, so it's not a surprise. But that was definitely one of the leaders we gravitated towards.
What do you, and how does that influence your business now? Like, so think about your culture and the people that you've worked with that are in your org.
Yeah. I've worked with some folks for a while now. And one thing is you can lie to people for a little while. You can't lie forever, right? You can't fake the funk into perpetuity. So that's one thing with Chad, is that he really was very much himself. And I've tried to emulate that in my company. It's like, I'm not going to try to pretend to be this perfect leader. I'm going to just be who I am, but apply those principles to who I am. So, my messaging to my team is always consistent because I don't have to think about who am I trying to be right now. It's just, this is who it is. But I definitely try to apply the lessons and principles that he had taught around, high standards for myself. Like, I'm always going to push myself to do a good job for the team. Like, how can I break down barriers? How can I learn from you? Because I don't know everything. I may have been around here longer, but you in that seat know more about your problem than I know. So help me understand. And that's one of the leading questions I have for folks is, help me understand X. Help me understand why you feel that way. And having that mentality of being humble and knowing that I don't know everything and I can't know everything, but my goal is to know enough to move us forward and break down barriers, is like a skill set that a lot of leaders really lack. And so I've tried to emulate that from Chad as much as I can.
That's great. Kyle, I know we're kind of coming close on time here, so I want to, respect that. Want to just have one last piece, and actually, could you talk about this Lead the Way Fund and what that's all about?
Yeah. So there are a few charities I definitely try to support. I appreciate you doing a little plug here. So Lead the Way Fund, the term Rangers Lead the Way, that's where this term comes from. They really help to try to help Rangers who are transitioning out, their families. If Rangers had lost their lives, their family members and spouses, they try to support as much as possible. So it's one of the nonprofits that I try to support as much as I can, try to donate money where possible. I also tell people that if they want to take a demo with me, or if they want me to take a demo, make a donation to Lead the Way Fund and send me the receipt. I'll take a demo for anything to support that. So that's something I'm happy to do.
Very cool. We put a banner here that just kind of, I took off of their website that just talks about the different things that they do. One of the things I want to share with you, obviously this is Memorial Day weekend coming up. Helen and I are both, kind of members of a small group of community leaders across the Marketo space. I don't know how much exposure. I know we've worked a little bit in Marketo together, but on the Salesforce side of things, but have just been passing word around about this presentation and talking to some of the other MUG leaders around the world. And we're going to pull together and do a donation to the Lead the Way Fund actually for Memorial Day. Just in thanks for you spending the time here with us, and also to support our soldiers overseas and domestically as well too.
It's my pleasure. I really appreciate you doing that. That's more than I could have asked for. So thank you so much.
I think the other thing that we want to do here too, and we're just kind of getting everybody rallied around this, is because we're in the marketing tech space, I think we have a unique set of skills. So we want to work to build out a landing page, and then, a lot of us have a pretty good base of followers online in the social media space. So we'd love to be able to build something like that out. Maybe it's a GoFundMe page. We're just working the details
Yeah.
out now, but we want to set that up hopefully in the next week here, and then also just drive people to that, so that more people have access to the page. We have the website up here, leadthewayfund.org, and we'd love to be able to kind of pool some of the attributes and the resources that we have to be able to kind of support that cause for Memorial Day, and for everything that we have as a result of service from people like yourself. So thank you.
I appreciate that. And I think that folks forget that, like, your skills may not be, I'm a military liaison or helping military folks, but there are lots of things like this you can do. Just sharing that these types of organizations exist for veterans broadly, independent of the Lead the Way Fund. There are a lot of groups out there doing great things, and just sharing that with folks who are interested, just like you. People want to help veterans. It's very clear, right? It's been fantastic. I've never had anything negative said to me, especially relative to folks who came home from Vietnam. It's been a very different experience. And I've just been so thankful that I've had such a great support network coming home from overseas. And every person I talk to is nothing but supportive. And this is just more indication of that. People want to help veterans. And so if you're looking for ways to do it as an individual, there's obviously you can donate time or money, but time in this way, because you have skills that other folks don't have. So this is hugely appreciated. Thanks so much.
Yeah. Great, guys. Okay, so let's just do one quick chat about the next MarTech book club. So tentatively, we've stubbed out the date for July 24th at 12 p.m. Eastern, so again on a Friday. And I think what we're going to do this time is just kind of pick up one of the books that was in Marketo Summit a couple of years ago that Christina Zuniga from the Santa Barbara Marketo user group had recommended, On the Edge with Allison Levine. And Allison had reached out to us last time when we were considering this book for the last year's summer edition book club. So we might reach out to her again, and hopefully she'll be willing to join us as a guest speaker on that one as well too. If anybody, everybody who has signed up, would love to see you again too. It's kind of hard Friday than a long weekend, right? But you can visit our conversionstore.com/book club, and we'll have just a sign up page for you to get on the invite list, and we're just setting that up right now, so you should have that in a couple of days. Thank you everybody very much, and Helena, any words from yourself?
It was very interesting. Thank you, Kyle. I learned a lot. Thanks a lot.
Sure thing. Thanks so much for having me.
Okay, guys. Yeah, have a great weekend. Happy Memorial Day to everybody.
Have a good one.
Memorial Day.
Bye.